back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, JRB Laws, and this is my co-host.
Christopher Wells.
We appreciate all the support on all of our recent content across all platforms. We have some very big news, that's come out revolving a certain player. I think you all can guess who. And to skip all the chit chat before we get down to business, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
Yeah, so we finally got the big trade that we've kind of been waiting for, since the offseason for the most part, and that's the trade of James Harden going to the Los Angeles Clippers.
Yeah,
So, obviously we already know a lot of what's been going on in terms of, how this started, right? In terms of Harden wanting out, right? The issues with, Philadelphia and him, not really seeing eye to eye on, a contract, a new contract. And this was kind of in the making for a while, right? I think we both kind of predicted for a while at a certain point. I think you kind of leaned towards the idea that he might go somewhere else.
mm-hmm.
I still kind of stood by that he was probably just going to go there.
Right.
Um, just because it didn't seem like there were any other teams that really had any interest. Like at least with the Lillard trade, we heard that there were lots of other teams that wanted him, but we just weren't sure if they could actually get him. But with Harden, it was really just kind of the Clippers. There was a little New York buzz early, but then that kind of went away, and I
Right.
think that makes sense. I think the Knicks should have done that, and they didn't. Um, but he ended up going to the Clippers. So in terms of the full trade, Harden, right? He and PJ Tucker, and Philippe Petrusev, which
Yeah.
is like I guess one of the Sixers, draft picks or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
They go to the Clippers. Philadelphia gets, a number of Clippers, expiring deals. So Nicholas Batum, Robert Covington, Kenyon Martin Jr., Marcus Morris Sr. They also get two firsts, right? A 2026 protected first, and a 2028 first from the Clippers. The 2026 first comes over from Oklahoma City, who had that pick. And they get a 2027 first from the Clippers, in order to, make these picks work. And then the Sixers also get a second round pick, um, from the Pacers, I believe, and then
Mm-hmm.
also 2029 first. So we got some pick swaps, we got seconds. So all in all, there's a lot to kind of I think dissect here. When you look at the Clippers, obviously they get the guy that they wanted, right? Harden gets his way; he gets to go to the Clippers. The Clippers didn't have to give up, any of their young guys, right? Like a Terrence Mann, or I guess he's not young, but like Norman Powell, they didn't have to give up him. They did have to give up some of those, forwards, and wings or whatever, and that could potentially be something down the line. But those guys, in fairness, were also older.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think for the Sixers, right, this is kind of an intriguing part because they didn't get a star, but they did do, their part in terms of getting a bunch of expiring contracts, getting picks. And I think that that will allow them for some more flexibility. And they do kind of, also end the Harden drama, right, which I feel like probably just would have been a real drain on the team. Um, if it, had continued to go on. So I feel like in this way, it's probably kind of just a everybody wins situation. Because again, with the Sixers, you didn't get a star, but you did get, picks and expiring deals, which again, I think short term is probably going to be kind of rough because you don't get the same level of talent back, but you do get some wings to probably prop up the defense. And then it just also gives Tyrese Maxey more opportunities, and we'll see what Nick Nurse does with that. Um, but, like I said, overall, I feel like it's probably a win-win. It's just for the Clippers, long term, obviously your optics aren't necessarily great because if it doesn't work out, right, everybody's I think is in like basically like one of the last years of their deals.
Right.
You got the new stadium. It is an older roster now. Throwing Harden in there, not quite as athletic and not quite as built on like wings in terms of the backups, but the starting five, I do think it'll be intriguing to see how that works out just because there's a lot of pieces in there, right? You assume Westbrook still starts with Harden in the backcourt, and then Paul George, Kawhi, I guess, moves over now to the four. So that's going to be kind of intriguing because he'll, I'm assuming he'll be tasked more with, kind of like defending the rim,
Right.
um, rebounding. And again, you do have Zubac as well and Plumlee, but still, it's a different look. But kind of, I guess to kind of go over it, I kind of gave my thoughts a little bit, and we'll get into more of it as well. But what
Yeah.
did you think overall of the deal?
Yeah. Well, for me, I'm looking at it from both sides, and I like it. Especially for the Sixers, I think, they've given themselves insurance, they've given themselves a safety net, and they're really thinking for the future. Like you said, with the cap space, now they're going to have, I think upwards 50 to 65 million in, salary cap next summer. So that's on track to, be a decent amount. And then, for right now, I know like these guys are expiring contracts, but this adds to their depth. I think Marcus Morris, Robert Covington, Nick Batum, and a young guy in KJ Martin. And then the picks as well. You can't really be too mad at that haul. And then all you had to really give up was Harden and PJ Tucker. I mean, in my opinion, I think that's a pretty nice haul for the Sixers. And then for the Clippers, obviously, you know, they've needed a change for a long time. They needed something else to add to the Kawhi and PG duo tandem. So I think Harden is a good addition. It just depends on how well does it work out long term. Like you said, we're not sure because Harden does have a tendency to force his way out. I think this is his fourth trade since 2021, so that's a crazy stat if you want to look at it from that point of view. But overall, can't be too mad at it from both sides. I think this was a deal that needed to be done as soon as possible. End the drama and just get down to business and play some basketball.
Right, yeah, because I think that's the main thing is just it wouldn't have been good if it had continued to drag out.
Yeah,
And I feel like, again, I don't think a whole lot of teams really wanted Harden, and I think that's kind of why, we just never heard anything about other teams wanting him. Because again, there is the concern of, well, hey, there's one specific team he really wants to go to, and if he doesn't go there, will he cause a stink? In a way that you may not be worried as much about if it were Lillard. I know his agent put the stuff out there, but still. Um, but it is kind of interesting, right? Just the fact that he ended up, getting his way. Lillard, he wanted to go to Miami, he didn't go there. He went to the Bucks, which is still a fine situation,
yeah,
but
yeah.
it is just kind of interesting with Harden how he's been able to force, despite the, questions that people have in terms of some of his conduct, right? He still has been able to get to everywhere he goes.
Right.
Um, so I think, it's going to be intriguing because, again, Harden and Westbrook, like I mentioned before, they played together for Houston. It didn't necessarily work out in the end, but, again, this time it's different personnel where they're no longer like the two main guys, right? They're playing, behind Kawhi and Paul George.
Yeah.
So, again, the depth is obviously weaker now, but you do get some more help up, up top in the roster. And I said, like, they probably needed to figure out a way to consolidate some of the guys that they have, and they still got to keep Terrence Mann and
Yeah,
Norman
that's
Powell.
the big thing.
Either yeah, so you can either, keep those guys or you can just potentially move those guys maybe for some other pieces down the line.
Hmm.
So like I said, I think overall, I think nobody should really be unhappy in this situation.
Right.
It's just again, I think for the Clippers there's pressure just because again, if it doesn't work out, right, then you really have a problem where you don't really have much to look forward to after that. But at least for the Sixers, you didn't get a talent upgrade, but like we talked about, you do get some, depth pieces and even if it doesn't work out, you'll have the flexibility for cap space, which again, I don't think they're going to sign anybody, but
Right.
maybe you can trade for somebody.
I
Um,
think that's their goal.
Down the line.
I
Yeah,
think that's what they're doing. They're trying to get the second round picks, the first round picks, and
right.
then that could give them a chance to get like a really,
Yeah,
super high level point guard or, another guard to pair with
and
Embiid.
yeah, exactly. And I think for now that's probably the plan where you're probably trying to tell Joel Embiid, "Hey, we got some more assets for Harden, so if you just hold on a little bit longer, we might be able to pull something, at the deadline maybe, right, where they can kind of flip those pieces for somebody, maybe like a Zach Levine or, somebody like that. I don't know,
Right.
just we know that there will probably be guys available at the deadline.
Oh, for sure.
You know,
It always
yeah,
happens. Somebody's not going to be
yeah,
happy with their situation.
exactly. Yeah, at least for a couple of teams, because there's
Right.
always situations, where they don't work out in the way that they might have thought. So then, teams end up kind of selling some guys.
Mm-hmm.
Because there will be some, right? Because there will be some teams that eventually kind of realize, yeah, there's probably not a whole lot to look forward to this season. So, again, I think, you also kind of look at like, how do the fans kind of react? And it seems like a lot of the Philadelphia fans are overall relatively enthused by the deal. Because again, the Harden thing was just becoming kind of a headache. And
He
again, you don't
wasn't playing.
necessarily right, exactly. He wasn't playing, so you get, some guys for somebody, and then you just kind of, go from there, right? You take Nick Nurse, you take the progression from Tyrese Maxey, right? The change in the offense that they've ran. Maybe they'll run a little bit faster offense. Maybe some of the other guys will play a little bit differently. I mean, you just go from there. Again, I still feel like right now there's still, a tier below the other East teams at the top. But, again, you do have the flexibility maybe come the deadline or in the offseason to do something because that's kind of where they have to get that right. Because
Yeah.
I think, in terms of the assets for Harden, not, that's not too bad because, again, you got multiple picks and you got expiring contracts. A lot of teams could potentially take those on. But you still have to turn that, I think, into something if you're going to continue to roll with, Embiid here. And for now, that's what it seems like, right? Like we haven't had any real indications that they're looking to blow something up. You know what I mean?
Right.
So right now, I think step one of this quote unquote process or whatever you want to call it, I think, is complete. And now it's just kind of about where you can go from there.
Yeah.
So, I mean, and then again, like I said, from the Clippers' perspective, I think it is going to be intriguing to see how they play because, like you and I have both said at different times, they needed a change. I didn't think that the roster, as currently constructed, was good enough. Now you have a chance, because you have some more star power. But again, it's still going to come down to health, right? Because these guys are guys that generally miss a lot of time, and that
Hmm.
includes Harden at this point. Um, but you have some more flexibility from the in the backcourt because now you can run some lineups where like hey, let's see what happens if it's just Westbrook and some guys or Harden and the other two stars, right?
Right.
Um, how do the bigs look, right? Zubac and Plumlee, right? Their role will be intriguing, I think, because now your guards are going to be better rebounders. So what does that mean going forward for those bigs? Again, obviously they're kind of their last line of defense on the interior. So I don't know. I mean, like I said, I think short term it should help the Clippers. I don't necessarily know if I would still feel, super confident about it. I still feel like, as of right now, the Nuggets probably still feel like, hey, we can beat any of those teams.
Easily.
But again, if you're the Clippers, I mean, you got to do something, right? You got to shake it up because again, like the future was going to be pretty rough anyways. So I mean, why not kind of just make a gamble and see if it pays off? Because you
Right.
never know, right? You could have a scenario where this one time, right, everybody just manages to be healthy, and then maybe they actually do get out of the West. So I can't necessarily be mad at it from a Clippers perspective. It's just again, it's a scenario where this has to work, and if it doesn't work, I think the Clippers will be in a really rough spot because again, your picks are gone. These guys could potentially leave if it doesn't work out, or if they come back, then you're just paying a bunch of older guys a lot of money. So there's a lot of pressure now, I think, for this Clippers team to get this done. In terms of being competitive and being a legitimate championship team because they have to do it because if they don't, there's going to be some problems down the road.
Yeah, and that's the thing, and they didn't give up, too much. They didn't give up any stars. The only star that was really involved in this was James Harden. So they kept, the solid construction of their roster, intact, which is a good thing. So, this is really putting them to the test. And like you said, they need to get this done. Like if they don't, make a deep playoff run, then I think, they need to call it quits on this.
Yeah, because again, at this point, if you can't get it done with that grouping, then you're probably just not going to get it done.
Right. Because
Because
this
at
has
that
been a
point,
thing
right?
since 2019.
Yeah, yeah, and then by that point, everybody's still a year older,
Right.
right? And situations aren't really going to change. There's not really any more room for improvement. So yeah, this is a win now move, obviously.
Yeah,
Because again,
clearly.
we talked about it before, right? Because they had to do something, they had to get something done, and they got it done. So now it's just about can they stay healthy and can they compete?
Yeah.
So, ultimately, do you feel like that there like is, because we both said that like everybody should feel good, but do you still feel like there's like one ultimate winner of the deal where it's like they should feel the best about it?
I would say probably Philly. Um,
Okay.
they've given themselves assets and for the future.
Right.
They're looking, to the future, which I think is a smart move. I think it's always better to look towards the future than a win now move. But, it just depends on your situation. I think, the Clippers isn't a bad move by any means, in my opinion. I just have a little bit
Right.
more questions on it just because um, we don't really know what this trio is going to look like. I know that they do have a lot of scoring potential. I think now since they do have Harden, Westbrook, Paul George. I think
Right.
they have like three of the top six active players in points scored, um, which who have never won the title. So there's a chip on their shoulders. These guys need a title. I would say I think they're deserving of it, but they need to get over that big mountain, which is Denver, and I don't think that this team is capable of that.
Yeah, I mean the main thing is it makes their offense more versatile, right? Because
Yeah.
now it's no longer, just Kawhi and Paul George kind of just taking turns. Now you have a little bit more to work with. But I am curious, right? Because those guys, Kawhi and Paul George, like to play with the ball in their hands, as do Westbrook and Harden. So now that's kind of the challenge I think now is getting all those pieces to fit, right? Because again, you have four guys where most of them do their best work and their main interest is playing on the on the ball. I think Paul George, he can play off the ball, obviously, because he's playing next to Kawhi,
Yeah.
and Kawhi generally handles, some of the other, scoring isolation one-on-one duties.
Right.
But, Westbrook and Paul George, they don't play off the ball normally, right? Because they've been used to playing with the ball in their hands forever because they're point guards, basically.
Yeah.
So,
Um.
I think
And
it's going to be an interesting challenge.
yeah, and like to kind of look ahead, I guess we should talk about how they're going to incorporate them and when. So, the Clippers, they do start a back-to-back, I think, in LA
Yep.
on Tuesday. So then they play the Lakers on Wednesday. And then I
Right.
think after that they have 4 days off. So I'm going to assume that they're probably going to try and incorporate them in the 4 days off, and then they have the opening 3-game road trip in New York against the Knicks. So I think we'll probably look to see them play on Monday.
Yeah, it just kind of depends on when the trade gets finalized because I
Right.
think there's still like a couple of kinks that have to be ironed out. I think I think like because I'm not sure if it's official yet. So once that's official and then they do the physicals, then they may be available to play. Maybe Wednesday. We'll see.
Yeah.
But that's probably the earliest they can play because they're not going to be able to play. On Tuesday, right? Because
Right.
we're
Right. Right.
recording this, on Tuesday, so they're not going to be able to play. But they may be available Wednesday, and then, like you said, if not, then they'll be available, after that 4 day break.
Yeah,
So
I'm thinking
we'll
it's the
get
I'm thinking it's the 4 day break. It has to be.
right. Yeah, so we'll get a look at them eventually, and we'll kind of see some of the early intriguing bits of it. So
Yeah.
again, because and again, like certain guys should be kind of reinvigorated, right? Because again, with the Clippers, right, Harden got to where he wanted to go, and I think the Sixers should be kind of invigorated, right? Because they got rid of the Harden drama going on. We'll see what happens with Philly in terms of because they should still be able to win regular season games as long
Hmm.
as Embiid is healthy, regardless. But like I said, I think it's going to be really fun just to kind of see where things go. Because again, we
Yeah.
finally got this done and we can talk about it, and we'll be able to see it soon enough. Like I said, I think with the Sixers, they're not done um, for now, just because again, we'll see what they do with these pieces. But as of the Clippers, this is probably close to the final roster unless they end up trading one of those other guys like a Man or a Powell
Yeah.
at the deadline because now they got rid of a lot of those mid-tiered contracts, right? Because like Morris is gone, Toombs gone, Covington's gone, right? So after that, right, it's Mann and Powell, and I think that's pretty much it for like your mid-tier deals. Although
Yeah.
like Norman Powell's making a decent amount of money, so I wouldn't really call it a
Right.
mid-level
Right.
contract. Still, like this is probably close to the final version of this roster, unless they trade one of those other guards.
Right.
So I mean, yeah, overall, so like, does this change your perception of either of those teams as quote unquote off seasons? I know this isn't the off season
Right.
anymore, but I think we were overall pretty low on Philly's off season. And I think the Clippers we were kind of just mixed meh on it.
Hmm.
Um, so I guess kind of going back to that, right? Do you feel a different way about how those teams kind of handled stuff now, or are you pretty much kind of like in the same spot as before?
Um, I like Philly a lot more now. I think to repeat myself, the
Yeah,
the um the assets are very important. I think assets are very underrated. So them getting these things for future trade capital, I think that's something that's very undervalued and underrated. So that would probably boost my grade up. I can't remember the grade off
I
the
think you
top of
gave
my
him
head.
an F. I
Okay,
think you
well
gave
then
him
yeah,
an
they
F
go up
tier.
to like a C then, C or B, because I think that's pretty good. And then for the Clippers, um, that also will go up as well, just because adding star talent never really hurts you too bad unless it's a Gobert trade. But in terms of Philly, I think you can't really be too mad at this because you're getting all-star point guard, former MVP James Harden. So I mean, you can't really hate on that except for just be prepared for the drama. But in terms of looking at it from a basketball standpoint, yeah, I think it's going to be interesting to see
Yeah.
some ball dominant players playing together.
Right. Yeah. I think you feel better about the situations for these teams after this deal. So, and again, that's tends to be the best type of deals is when
Yeah.
everybody wins.
Do you think
And
the
gets what
Clippers
they
will be better than the Suns?
want. I guess like from that perspective, they have, Kawhi and Paul George who are better defensively,
Hmm.
than anybody that the Suns have. But then the
Right.
issue for the Clippers is you still don't really have a great option with your guards defensively in terms of like how do you slow down, like Beal and Booker.
Hmm.
I guess now you can probably say, well, since Kawhi and Paul George don't have as much of offensive load to carry, maybe they'll be able to be better more consistent defensively because I feel like Kawhi's defense has not been quite the same.
Yeah,
But
I
again, it's
agree.
still going to be a lot to handle in terms of that, the offensive firepower from those guys. So I
Yeah.
think it just kind of comes down to what you get out of the Clipper guards, right? Because you get two guys in Westbrook and Harden that haven't necessarily been, great offensive performers in the postseason where their efficiency drops.
Hmm.
Whereas, like Booker, right, he's generally been pretty good in the playoffs. Obviously, B we haven't seen in the playoffs as of late, but again, I think as a third option, that'll be a tough matchup for the Clippers. But
Right.
again, at the same time, like the Suns are also like a relatively smallish team if Nurkic and Eubanks aren't playing as much, and that might be a problem for the Suns just because that means like now Nurkic is going to have to try to be the last line of defense against like Westbrook and Harden, and Westbrook can play downhill. Harden doesn't get to the line as much anymore, but still he's a bigger physical guy, and
Hmm.
then obviously Kawhi and Paul George. So
Right.
it'll be interesting. So I think it'll be like kind of a matchup where last year it seemed like the Clippers in that first game against the Suns played very well. Um, because of the Kawhi issue where the Suns just didn't have anybody, for Kawhi, and then Paul George didn't play. So we'll see. But I do feel like both teams, should give each other different looks at the playoffs. Because again, with the Clippers, it's the wings where there's the strength, and then for the Suns, it's the guards. And then Durant is, I guess, more of a four now than a three. So I wouldn't really call him as much of a wing now. But
Right.
still, I think it's kind of a situation where like both teams' strengths, right, kind of like negate the other's weaknesses. You know what I mean?
Hmm. I get you.
So,
I'm in the same
so
boat.
I think that's yeah. So I think that's a matchup where it should be kind of a back and forth matchup.
Yeah, I think that's the matchup to watch. Both big threes, and the Clippers now have a newly assembled one, so I think that's definitely the matchup to look forward to.
Right. Um. But yeah. So now, after that trade, now we're gonna kind of get into some talks about like the rookies, right? Because obviously, it's only been a week basically, so it hasn't really been like a ton of time. To really digest everything, but just kind of going around the league in terms of like just discussing some of the rookies that have overall been impressive. Which guys have started off kind of slow. Um, so I guess we'll start with some of the obvious ones, right? Obviously, Wenbanyama, he's overall, I think he's been fine. As a rookie, I think he's been good actually.
Hmm.
Obviously, there's been a couple of games, right? Like, I went to see him against the Clippers, and he didn't play very well.
Right.
Um, but I think overall he's been pretty much, the whole package in terms of what we asked for, right? Like a guy who has been able to do things on both ends of the floor. Um, obviously the 3-point shot's been pretty rough, but around the basket he's been good. Blocking shots he's been good. So I don't think he can really complain about it. And I think it's a rough situation because again, they don't have a point guard. Um,
Mm.
again, they're starting so on point guard. I saw it in person. And I just don't like it. I just I don't feel like he's a point guard. I think he's a good player. I just don't think he's good as a point guard. And I think that takes away from a lot of his strengths, right? Where he's a forward, he can kind of cause some chaos.
Hmm.
He can battle for extra possessions, set some screens. Whereas as a point guard, I think, he's just, he's handling the ball, which I don't think is a strength of his. I think he's a decent passer, but I kind of prefer it more so like in sort of like a hey, I have the ball maybe like in the high post and maybe kicking it to a cutter or something,
Right.
not necessarily bringing up the ball and passing the ball because against the Clippers, it just kind of looked like a game of 2K where they're just kind of like bringing the ball up the floor and just getting ripped every other
Right.
possession, or just throwing passes and guys are just jumping the passing lanes and getting steals. It's just rough. So I feel like with Wemby, I think because you don't really have like a great option at the point guard spot, again, there's going to be games where I think the struggles will be a little inconsistent. And again, because he's small, right, or he's very light, right. The Clippers players, even though they were smaller, they were just being more physical. Um, but I think a real shout out to a guy who I think has been really good as a rookie so far, has been Brandon Miller,
Hmm.
right? I mean, he was the number two pick. He was a guy that I think a lot of people were not necessarily sure about because a lot of people felt like Scoot was kind of the obvious pick. But so far he's been really good. In fairness, he's been playing off the bench, right, as a sixth man. But still, regardless, I think he's done really good. Um, I mean, like you look at his first three games, he's been averaging, 17 points, 6 rebounds, 2 assists, 47 from the field, 44 from three. I mean, I think those are really good numbers
Yeah.
um, for a Charlotte team. Again, where without Bridges, you don't really have a lot of amazing wing options, right? You have Hayward, who's older now. Um, So I think he kind of, helps out and kind of gives them a lot of what they need. And it kind of goes back to what we said about like the idea of like, Scoot may be the better guy down the line, but, Miller looks like, he's kind of ready out of the gates, to
Right.
do some stuff, as a scoring forward, um, that can kind of do a lot of different things on the offensive side of the ball. Um, so I think if you're Charlotte, you got to be pretty pleased with what you got there. So you can kind of give your thoughts on Wemby and Brandon Miller before we get to some other rookies
Yeah, yeah.
that have all been good.
Yeah, Wemby, the only thing that concerns me is just the efficiency. That's it. The numbers, they look good, 15 points, and then, he's doing that on 12, I think, attempts, so not horrible, and then 44 from the field. Like you said, the three-point percentage is pretty rough, 23. That's something that you don't really want to see. I would like to see him get a little bit more rebounds. But that could just be me. I think him being down low would help. I do understand that they are putting him at the power forward position, so that is why his rebounds are a little bit lower than you would like. But overall, can't be too mad at it. Like I said, just efficiency is my only gripe with that. But Brandon Miller has been hooping on a whole nother level. 17 points. I don't need to go through the stats. You already did. But the fit, I think, looks really good for
Right.
Charlotte. He can play off the ball. He can play on the ball, and he has sneaky athleticism where it's like, okay, yeah, he has the height, but you don't normally look at him and be like, okay, this guy is like bounce, bounce. But yeah, he has bounce. And then defensively, I think he's pretty good as well. He's had a couple of chase down blocks, so the hustle is there, and he's averaging point 0.7. He's not really averaging one, but it's close. So I like everything that I've seen from these top two guys. So I love it.
Yeah, exactly. Because again, like, again, Miller, he was kind of clowned, at different points, in the sense of like, that pick,
Yeah,
just because again, like, some people thought, different things, but like I said, even though, I was looking at Scoot as number two, I still felt like Brandon Miller was still going to be good. You know what I
yeah,
mean? Like, and
I
he's
agree.
really good, as a rookie. Like, I think, again, like fit wise, it makes sense because they kind of needed, some type of wing to kind of take over that Hayward spot eventually since he's older. So, I think fit wise, it makes sense. So, I mean, I think I thought he was going to be really good, and so far he's been really good.
Yeah.
Um, Moving on to some other rookies, right? A little bit different, just because he's because he was drafted a year before, but didn't get to play at all. Chet Holmgren,
Hmm.
right? Through his first few games, right, he's been averaging 15 points, 6 rebounds, an assist. Obviously, from the shot blocking perspective, right, he's averaging just about 3 blocks a game.
Yeah.
60 from the field, 63 from three, right? Obviously, that's going to change, right? Because you're not going to shoot those percentages over the course of a season. But he looks ready, on both ends of the floor. He's been a real factor, and he's, obviously outside of Shea, right? He's been like the other, like, biggest contributor to, Oklahoma City's really good start so far.
Hmm.
Um, and again, this is a guy that we both thought, when he was drafted last year, that he was going to be, really good. But I think, again, it's really intriguing to see just defensively, how he's such a game changer for Oklahoma City because of his size and length, right? Because again, they didn't have any real bigs last year. And now they got one in him. And he's also, shown some skill on the offensive side of the ball, too.
Yeah. Um, Chet, I mean, you pretty much hit the nail on the head, on all his stats and whatnot. But this is my pick for defensive player of the year, and I think so far he's been playing some good defense. I think in his first game it was a little rough, but since then, he's come along very well. Like you said, very efficient. He's averaging 15. And then like you said, with the 6 rebounds and the 3 blocks, I think that's what you need, and that's what OKC needed the whole time. So I think we can look for Chet Holmgren and OKC to have a really good season, and specifically Chet his rookie season.
Right. Yeah. And then moving on to some other guys. We already mentioned Derek Lively, in
Hmm.
his debut. The last couple of games, the numbers haven't been, as great, but the impact I think is still there.
Yeah.
Just in terms of giving Dallas like a real option, at that center spot in terms of, the rim protection,
Hmm.
and the lob threat. So, obviously we've already kind of been over that. Jordan Hawkins, he's another guy, right, that I think early on he's played a lot more than I thought, and I think some of that has been due to New Orleans, injury
Hmm.
situations. But I think he's still taking advantage, of his opportunities. Right, he's been a really good shooter for them, 40% from three, 45 from the field.
Yeah.
Right, so I think overall he's kind of been a guy, where I think we overall like the pick. Right, 9 points a game. But I think in the opportunities he's been given, he's been pretty solid. Which again, like I wouldn't have expected him playing as much for them, but they've kind of needed him with them being shorthanded with a number of guys out.
Yeah, and Jordan Hawkins was a guy I was very high on in this draft. He can hit the three, and like the the thing about him is he hits threes better when they're contested, which is kind of interesting. So that's something to watch. But he's a big time shot maker, and he takes a lot of threes. So for him to be shooting 40% from the three is really good. I think that's around what he shot in college. So right on track to being what I thought he would be.
Right. Yeah, and then in addition to those guys, right, Asor Thompson for Detroit, right? Obviously he's been a guy that we've already talked about, right, in terms of just being, really an all-around versatile player for them, right? Averaging over 10 rebounds a game, getting 2.5 blocks a game. Again, some of these numbers will change over time, but you can already see the flashes of, the things he can do, you know, from just the all around perspective, right? The defense, the rebounding, the athleticism, right? The offense is still kind of a work in progress, but um, regardless, he's done a lot of other things that I think you got to be pretty pleased with so far because you don't usually see a lot of rookies come in and defend well. And I think that is kind of something that's really intriguing is there's a number of rookies who, have played some really good defense. And that's usually kind of one of the things that, early on for a lot of young guys, it doesn't always click. But again, props to Asor because I think he's been really good, as well as Cason Wallace because again, he's been coming in, as a backup guard and doing some things on both ends. So I think you got to be pleased with those guys so far.
Yeah, they've been underrated. We're pretty high on Asor, well-rounded game. So, as long as he keeps that up, I think he'll be a-okay. And then Cason Wallace is definitely another part of, OKC's success, adding to their depth. I think that was another thing that they did very well and in the draft, and then obviously getting Chet. So, I think these guys are impact players and, they'll be around for a long time if they keep up the play.
And then this guy is a little bit different because he's much older. But what do you think of the Kings rookie so far? Sasha Vezenkov, right? The guy coming over from Europe. I think he was like a EuroLeague MVP,
Hmm.
if I'm not mistaken. And he's kind of just come in, mainly as like a catch and shoot guy.
Yeah.
But what have you thought of him so far?
Yeah, it's funny. Well, he, averages around 10 points. I think he's pretty good in the 15 minutes per game that he does play. I think, he makes the most of it. He's shooting 50% from the field and then 40 from 3. So, very efficient. And it's kind of interesting. I noticed something when I was watching one of the Kings games. I can't remember who it was against, but I know um Keegan Murray, he passed up a wide open 3. And then um Mike Brown, he was like, "Yeah, Besenkov, you're coming in. Like, you can't pass up threes." And then all of a sudden, Keegan Murray on the next possession just jacks a three and makes it, and then he tells Besenkov to get back to the bench. So it's kind of interesting. I think that's something that's underrated is about you know lighting fires under people. I think this pick, although it's a great depth pick, and he does do things like shooting and things like that. I think it's a player that's also there to light the fire under some of the younger guys as well. Like, yeah, this guy might be coming for your job, if you don't play the way that we want you to play. So, but overall, I think he's had a, very good start. Like I said, in the 15 minutes that he does play, he does make the most of it with his efficient shooting.
Yeah, exactly. Because again, like he's older, so he's kind of just sort of just coming in to fill a role, just to give the Kings more options, for the shooting
Yeah,
from a shooting perspective, the 3 point shooter, because that's a big part of the Kings' offense.
he's 28.
Um, yeah, exactly. So, I guess now we're gonna kind of get to some of the rookies, who have struggled, and I'll kind of let you, take the lead, for this segment a little bit more.
Sure.
But I'll start off with the first guy, who's kind of gotten off to a little bit of a slow start, but I don't think it's necessarily like a cause for concern or worry.
Hmm.
And that would be Scoot, Scoot Henderson, right? He was the third pick of the draft. He went to Portland. Um, you know, and he's kind of gotten the reins to some of the offense.
Hmm.
Although like it's a weird team just with a bunch of different guys. But he's kind of struggled early on through his first few games, right? He's you look at the numbers, and he's shooting like 33% from the field. I
Yeah.
mean, we knew like the shooting would be kind of rough because that's not really like a huge strength of his, but 8 points a game, 4 assists, 4 turnovers, and also 4.5 fouls a game as well. So it seems like it's been definitely kind of a little bit of a struggle, early on. And again, like, with Portland, it's a rebuilding team. So it's not like, there's necessarily a lot of favors being done. But still, um, I think it's going to probably take a little bit longer, and that's kind of what I thought. I thought that Miller would probably turn out to already kind of come in and be the more ready player, whereas Scooter would probably take some time, because for a lot of point guards, right, that are running the offense, it takes some time, to be able to run an NBA offense. So I think better days will be ahead of him, but I think he's definitely gotten off to a slow start so far.
Yeah, I agree. And it's kind of unfortunate, but at the same time, I think he'll pick it up. I think he's one of those guys that'll be very good in the long term. Because you got to keep in mind it's very hard guard wise. I think guard is probably the hardest position to adjust in terms of
Right.
level transitions. I think center is probably one of the easier ones. Not to say that it's easy, but easier than guard, I'd say. And then wing, I think, is also a little bit easier than guard because guard, you control the pace. If you don't
Right.
normally play well, the team doesn't normally play well. So I think that's just growing pains with him. I think that's going to be the narrative of, his first probably 2 seasons. But I think in his third season, we'll probably expect him to take that leap that we're all looking, you know, for him to take. Because I think, he has arguably the highest, potential out of, the top three picks. But, we just have to see it come to fruition with him.
Yeah, because I think it makes a lot of sense what you mentioned about the guard spot. Because again, just in general, like you said, and like how I thought, you're like you said, you're running an offense, controlling the pace. You got to learn the playbooks. In terms of because again, the way an NBA offense is constructed and ran is very different. From the lower levels of basketball, right? It's
Yeah.
because it's just it's a different talent level. It's a definitely a different adjustment in terms of like the athleticism and physicality, right? Because like now Scoot's a very good athlete, right? But when you come to the NBA, there's a lot of really good athletes there, as well, right? Like
Right.
just in general, you look around and that's a big adjustment. And again, with Portland, it's a lot of new guys as well. And that's the other part too. It's not just the fact that he's the point guard, but this is a very different team, from last year's squad, right? Just because of all the different pieces that they brought in. Um, from the Lillard deal. But either way, it's going to give him, it's going to give him the opportunity to go through some growing pains because now that he's not, necessarily sharing the backcourt minutes with Lillard, right? He's going to get to learn on the fly, and I think that's going to be good for him. It's just going to take some time because again, like Portland, they're also going to have some additional talent as well over the course of this rebuild. So I
Yeah.
don't think it's necessarily a cause for concern, but I did think he'd be a little bit better in terms of like his first few games. But again, like it's his first few games,
Yeah.
and even the defense, right? Like is something where hopefully he can improve on that end. But again, a lot of young guys come in generally and aren't necessarily great defensively, and you can see it with the foul trouble, right? Because I think when you mentioned the guards, in terms of like that's probably one of the hardest positions, to kind of adjust to at the NBA level. I think like from a foul perspective, if you're a guard, that should be an area where you shouldn't be fouling as much, right?
Right.
Because like if you're a guard and you got like 3, 4 fouls in the first half, that that I just think to me is not really a good thing. I feel like that's just kind of unacceptable because you're not necessarily protecting the rim. You're not the last line of defense. You're just kind of on the perimeter. And
Right.
and a lot of times when you see guards pick up fouls, it's usually off of like silly mistakes, right? Like guys kind of reaching in, to kind of take the ball from
Hmm.
somebody, or just kind of like just blindly running through a screen.
Frustration ones, or even
Yeah,
at the end of the game, intentional fouls. You don't normally see guards pick up fouls, and that might be a sign of lack of defensive discipline, but could be wrong.
right. Yeah, exactly. And again, that's the type of stuff that over time will get cleaned up. But
Yeah.
for now, you just kind of have to, live with it and just
Hmm.
kind of, learn along, the lines of everything. Just because, again, it's a young team, it's a rebuilding team, it's his first season in the NBA, after being in the G League Ignite. So, there's a lot to learn. So I still think there's better days ahead for him. But it's been a slow start. But what other rookies are you kind of looking at, that have kind of struggled either a little bit more than you thought, or just overall just have not played very well
Yeah,
early on?
it's kind of hard to gauge that because the sample size is so small at this point because there's a
Like,
lot of guys who have
right,
played a lot of minutes but they still haven't even scored, and these are top picks, like I think Jerace Walker hasn't recorded his first bucket yet, and then to bounce around, Cam Whitmore hasn't either, so there's some people that like haven't even really scored yet. But scoring isn't all that's involved in basketball. But to answer your question, there are some players that I think have struggled a little bit more than I would like to have seen. Grady Dick, I think, is one who's struggled a little bit. He hadn't played all that much. He does average like I think 14 minutes per game. And then, the points they're down because, it's not a lot of minutes. So, he's averaging 5 points on 38%. I think from three, it's fine. 36 is fine from three, but from the field, I'd like to see him be a little bit more efficient than 38. But I do understand that most of his shots are threes. And then Bilal Coulibaly, I think he's looked great on the defensive end, but from the perspective of offense, it's been very, very rough. He's shooting around 30% from the field and then 25 from three. So you can see that the offense is not polished at all, but the reason why he's out there is because of defense. And I think, he did make his first start on Monday against Boston. So that was kind of nice to see. But at the same time, you do want to see him get a better grip of the offense in the NBA, and that's the problem. The guards that transition is crazy because they're
Yeah.
relied on for a lot of the offense.
Yeah. What have you thought of Amin Thompson so far?
Yeah, that's a good talking point because I think you can look at it from two perspectives. You can say, okay, he's playing fine, but then you can also say you'd want more from him. The problem is he's only averaging about 17 minutes. He's not getting, I don't think, enough time to shine. I think if he was in the starting lineup, we'd be talking about him differently. I think his numbers would be up, and I think that would go for most of these rookies. But for him specifically, it's kind of hard to gauge. But because I think he's averaging what 7 points per game, on like 42% from the field. So not too sure, what's gonna go down with him.
Yeah, I guess the other thing that's kind of intriguing to me is that there's just a number of lottery picks who aren't playing, kind of as much as you would think.
Yeah,
Because you mentioned like only getting like 17, 18 minutes a game, and he was, what, the fourth pick in the draft.
fourth, yeah.
Uh, yeah,
And then you look at
exactly.
a sword, and
Jari,
he's averaging 30 minutes, and that's just
right,
one pick
exactly.
below.
Yeah, exactly. And then you look at, say, Jari Walker, right? He was the eighth pick of the draft, and he's not even really a part of the rotation
Right.
at all, right? Anthony Black, right? That's another guy where he was the sixth pick, and he's not playing at all. And it's kind of a rough spot because some of these teams, at least early on, right? They're trying to, be legitimate competitive teams. And that's kind of hard, I guess, because some of these guys, because they're rookies and they're, maybe a little bit raw, they're not necessarily just going to play them as much as you probably would like. So that's kind of the intriguing thing is just, again, the number of top 10, whatever picks that are either just getting very limited minutes or just no minutes at all, right? Because,
Right.
again, like, I'm kind of surprised that a guy who was drafted sixth overall, right, and Anthony Black is basically only playing in garbage time. I went
Yeah.
to the Lakers Orlando game and he didn't play at all. And I guess part of that is because it's a competitive game, but you would also think, hey, you're the sixth pick of the draft, on a team that, even though we know they'll probably be better, right? They don't have any like championship aspirations or
Right. You
anything,
should be
but
out there, in
still,
my opinion.
right. So that's kind of rough, I think, for some of these guys. But we'll see as it goes on because
Right.
I think at a certain point, some of these guys will get opportunities. Either due to knock on wood, some type of injuries, which has been a lot to start the season,
Hmm.
or trades or whatever. But yeah, it's just it's been kind of interesting because, like you said, some of them it's hard to gauge because one, it's a small sample size, and for two of them, there really almost is no real sample size to speak of. Like there's
Right.
no sample size for Anthony Black because he hasn't played. There's no real sample size for Jarius Walker other than preseason because he hasn't played.
Yeah.
Um, so that's
Granted, it's
something
been
that
4 games for some of these
right,
guys, so
exactly. Yeah, exactly. It's been 4 games, so I still feel like better days are ahead for some of those guys. But again, you still feel like, man, these guys, if they were really, really, really good, they'd be getting minutes. You know what I mean? They'd
right.
be getting minutes for some of these other guys. If they were, just awesome. But again, like a lot of these guys, they are rookies and they're young, so they're going to be works in progress. So,
Yeah.
so again, as we continue to, go over the course of the season, things will probably change. But
Yeah. And we'll probably
you know,
update it frequently.
right. Yeah, but some guys are just overall just because of the situation is going to get more opportunities,
Yep.
right? Like with Koulibaly, because the Wizards are not trying to be like a super competitive team, he'll play, for the most part.
Right. And he's
Over the
averaging
course of
21 minutes.
right. Yeah, exactly. But for teams like, a Houston or, an Orlando where like they're a little bit more incentivized to try to make the playoffs or the play in to compete for something because they have, more talent to work with. Those guys may not necessarily play. So that's kind of a rough spot to be in to be, a top 10 pick, but also just not play at all. But
Right.
we'll see. Um, and now I guess we'll kind of get into again another small sample size, right? But some of the standings going around in the NBA. In terms of the records for a lot of these teams. Obviously in terms of like the overall records, right? Obviously Denver, they're 4-0. They played 4 games. Are still a few undefeated teams, but they haven't played 4 games, right? The Celtics are
Hmm.
undefeated at 3-0. And the Dallas Mavericks are undefeated at 3-0. So again, the Nuggets and the Celtics are kind of two teams that we kind of assume would be probably towards the top of their conferences because I think we both feel like those are probably your two best teams in those conferences.
Yeah.
Um, and then kind of just, again, going along, right? Golden State and Oklahoma City at 3-1. Phoenix, Sacramento in the West at 2-1. With New Orleans, right? Lakers 2-2, Spurs 1-2, Timberwolves 1-2. The Timberwolves had a weird game where they had a big lead against Atlanta, and then just all of a sudden over the course of the game, then they ended up losing by double digits. Like they went halfway through the fourth quarter with only 2 points.
Crazy.
Um, just should never happen on that type of roster when you have
Yeah.
Edwards and Towns. But again, like just personally, I'm just still not a big believer in that Timberwolves team. Um, and then once you get to the bottom of the Western Conference, obviously the Jazz and the Blazers, right? Those are two teams that we thought would be towards the bottom 1-3. But the Houston Rockets at 0-3, right, which is not great, but this was a team where we thought that they added some talent, but still probably not enough to really be a playoff factor. But the team that's all the way at the bottom of the West right now is the Memphis Grizzlies. They are 0-4.
Yeah.
We talked about it in the previous episode where it's just been brutal for them. The obviously the Jaw suspension, which you're still 20 games away from him coming back basically. And then Steven Adams being out for the year, Brandon Clark, probably not coming back until close to the end of the year, if at all. It's just been awful for them, right? And again, like you're relying on Desmond Bain and Jaren Jackson Jr. to be your two best players, which again, they're both very good, but it's still a struggle. When they don't have a whole lot of size. And again, just they're relying a lot on a lot of guys that probably just, aren't necessarily horrible players, but it's going to be really hard, to win a whole lot of games. When you got Zaire Williams in the starting lineup, who's been fine, right?
Yeah.
But just the combinations of a lot of the guys they have. It's been really tough, right? They got whipped by the Mavs, in the last game, right, where Luca just had a crazy 35-point triple double,
Mm.
without Kyrie playing. But again, Marcus Smart, I think he's been okay. Um, I think in terms of his scoring, he's averaging 17 a game and 6 assists.
Hmm.
It's again still kind of an issue where like at the end of the games, you don't really love what he's doing. In terms of taking some shots. I think Jaren Jackson Jr. has been relatively fine. But again, they just don't have enough. And that's kind of a team where I'm kind of looking at them and I'm kind of seeing and I'm trying to wonder like down the line, what do they do? Because
Hmm.
it feels like it's a team that needs some type of deal, or some type of trade to get done. Because again, with Adams not coming back, you're really kind of, just begging for anybody to kind of come in as a center spot. I've heard some people, like a guy that covers the Grizzlies, I believe his name is Chris Vernon. He's a guy that's kind of been talking about the idea of, hey, look, maybe we can go get Robert Williams. Um, from Portland, and I think that would be kind of an intriguing grab. But they need somebody.
Yeah.
I think just kind of hold down the line while Ja's out, and it's really tough because again, like it's only 4 games in, but you haven't won a single game, and that means you're gonna have to basically go a week or two without any losses, just to get like a little over 500, which it's a tough ask, especially because again, they don't have the most amazing schedule, to kind of start off. They do kind of have a little bit of a brief reprieve for the next few games where they do play the Jazz and then they play the Blazers, for a couple of times. So there should be an opportunity to put some wins on the board there. But, then you're still playing teams like Miami, who's
Yeah.
also kind of struggled, but still that could be a tough matchup. They play the Clippers and the Lakers, the Celtics, the Suns, down the line. So there's a potential scenario where they could be, a month or two in the season, and they could still be towards the bottom part of that Western Conference. So they desperately kind of need to figure out something. And we talked about it before, but I didn't think that they'd get off to this rough a start. I knew it was probably going to be tough, but 0-4 was not necessarily something that I expected.
Yeah. The problem is they
And
just
it's
don't have a lot of depth.
yeah, but it is still early.
Yeah. That's the biggest thing about Memphis, and I watched them play in person, and It was honestly pretty ugly. It seemed like they were just looking for guys to be able to hit shots. Like you could just tell, like they weren't really running the offense through anybody specifically. They were kind of just passing the ball around, and whoever can make a shot, we just live with it. That's the problem. I think their offense is so messed up, without Ja, that it's visible that they're really, really struggling. I think defensively they're okay, but offensively it's just horrendous.
Yeah, and that's the thing is that like there's nobody kind of like waiting in the wings, who's playing right now where it's like you expect them to be much better, you know what I mean?
Right.
Because
Yeah.
again, they have some young guys, but not like guys that you're super wild about, right? Like say like a Jake LaRavia,
Hmm.
or like a David Roddy. Like it's just those guys are just they're probably just gonna kind of be what they are right now. So
Right.
that's the part as well. Desmond Bain, he mentioned, we got 78 games left. We might go 78-4. I don't necessarily know if that's going to happen, but
He sounds
um,
like the fans in the IG comments whenever they lose, like
yeah,
whatever the
but
win total is or the loss total is, they'll be like, yeah, 74-4.
yeah, but I mean, it's been a rough start for them. And then kind of going back to the Eastern Conference, right? The Celtics, we knew they were going to be probably towards the top. Um, the Pacers and the Magic, right? They're sitting at 2-3, right? At 2-1. I mean, you kind of basically have like a four-way tie
Hmm.
between 2 and 5, right? Where the Pacers, the Magic, the Bucks, and the Sixers are all 2-1. Then the Pistons, right? They're 2-2. The Bulls, right after that weird scenario with that meeting, right? They got to win over the Pacers, so they're 2-2. With the Hawks as well. And then at 9, 10, and then from like the 9 to 13 spot, right at 1-2, you have Cleveland, who's had some injuries to start off the year. Brooklyn, who we weren't necessarily super high on anyways, right?
Hmm.
Charlotte, right, 1-2. They have some injuries and some guys out as well. Um, the Knicks at 1-2, the Wizards at 1-2, and then at the bottom of the Eastern Conference, at 14 and 15, you have the Miami Heat and the Toronto Raptors, right? And the Raptors we weren't necessarily super high on. I mean, obviously, again, it's only 4 games,
Hmm.
but I just thought that what they did in the offseason was just relatively mediocre.
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
agree.
in fairness, you do have some things to look forward to in terms of some young players, improvement. Like Scotty Barnes, I think has been pretty good to start off the season. But still, like just in general, I just didn't necessarily feel great about their odds. They lost to Portland, which is not necessarily great. With pretty much all their main guys playing.
Yeah.
Um, but the team at the other team that's at the bottom, the Heat, it's been pretty brutal for them. They've had some competitive, I guess, performances, but like and also like they've also had a ton of injuries, right? Like they played the Bucks, right? The kind of which was would have been like a really big matchup, between them, right? Because that's the team that Lillard thought he was going to, and he didn't go there. But Bam didn't play, right? And without Bam, it really hurts your defense, right? You have Thomas Bryant who slid in as the starting center, but he's not as good, but he's
Right.
also nowhere near the same defender. He's not, he's a bad defender. So, when you have that, plus other guys out as well, right? Like Caleb Martin hasn't really played. Josh Richardson hasn't really played. He played in, the other night, but still he missed the first few games. And then, Lowry has been the starting point guard. And I think that's kind of been, also just rough as well, right? Because we saw him, kind of be the backup point guard down the stretch of the season. But, now he's kind of been pushed back in as a starter, and the efficiency's been fine. But, just in general, I don't feel like at this point you really want him to be, at 37, a starting point guard.
Right.
We see Chris Paul as a backup in Golden State, right? And, I feel like, at this point for Lowry, right, I don't think he's as good as Chris Paul at this point. So he should
Heck
probably
no.
be a backup as well.
Hmm.
So I don't know. I mean, again, we weren't necessarily super high on the Heat, in terms of them being able to get out of the East. We thought that they'd still probably be able to win some regular season games, but the injuries continue to strike them, and it's been tough.
Yeah. That's the problem with them. I think their Cinderella mojo is definitely gone from last year. I would say don't count them out yet. I think it's too early, and I know you're not counting them out. But just
Exactly.
talking to anybody, I would say don't count the Heat out because they
Yeah.
do have some positives like Tyler here. I think he's been pretty good. Coming off the trade rumors, but yeah, like you said, they've struggled pretty badly. They're below the Wizards. They're 1-3. They're not quite, at the Raptors. They're tied pretty much, but for
Yeah.
some reason Miami's above them. But it is kind of unfortunate to see, and it's surprising because both of those teams, in Memphis and Miami, were top teams last year in terms of what they were able to do to get to the post. Well, Miami wasn't a top team, in the regular season,
Got to the
but
finals.
yeah, in the postseason they were a top team, but then Memphis was a top team in the regular season. So it's kind of interesting
Right.
to see, the different starts. But I think, down the line, I think we'll be looking at Miami differently. I don't think they'll be in 14th, a month or two from now. I think they'll rise up because I think a couple of teams will fall, like Brooklyn, maybe
And if they can get
Chicago.
Yeah, and if they can get some of their guys back,
Yeah.
I think they'll be better. So I
Hmm.
think, I feel like, the Heat record wise will probably fix some stuff up, but I think they still have they still have a ways to go where I just feel like they just don't necessarily have enough right now to be able to get over the hump against
Right.
Boston. So I feel like right now feels like they're the best team in the East.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
yeah, so I think that's the, kind of the brutal part for Miami. But again, they've been able to kind of, get their plug their way out of holes. So we'll
Yeah.
see if they can do that. Because right now, like the hole is relatively small. Because as we've said with all the other stuff, it's only been 4 games. But
Yep.
obviously, ideally, you don't really want to get off to a slow start. I think in the East, there's a little bit more of a leeway just because there's not as many great teams in the Eastern Conference. But in the Western Conference, for a team like Memphis to start off 0-4, that's going to be tough because at a certain point, that hole may be a little bit too big. But again, it's still early, and like I mentioned with the Memphis schedule, right? They have a few games where they should be able, in theory, to win those games. Um, and be able to, kind of get their record a little bit back under control, right?
Right.
And then, you look at the Heat schedule, right? They play over their next 4 games, right? They play Brooklyn, they play the Wizards, they play the Lakers, and they play the Grizzlies. So, there's maybe an opportunity to, to maybe go 500 or a little over, but still, it's still early. So these are just kind of some early lookaways and takeaways from, what we're seeing.
Yeah, very early.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's pretty much it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Obviously the Harden trade, since that's pretty much done, there's really no other rumors going on. The rest is kind of just small stuff. Obviously, kind of just a last thing is, all the injuries, right, have kind of been brutal for a lot of these teams in terms of guys missing time and missing stretches. But, just overall, um, that's pretty much all we got to really talk about. So, I mean, again, continue to like, comment, and subscribe. Let us know your thoughts on, on our takeaways so far in terms of what we've seen, from all these things over the course of the regular season so far, right through the first 4 or 5 games. And again, can keep in mind we still have that TikTok that we put up, right? Obviously we still have Instagram where we put our content there as well. So, again, continue to like, comment, and subscribe, and we'll see you next week.